Hello and welcome back. I have been watching General Hospital for many years, long enough to remember when storylines moved at a slower, almost gentler pace, where consequences unfolded gradually and characters had more time to breathe between major twists. But in recent years, and especially with the current developments surrounding Jordan Ashford and Jen Sidwell, I find myself both fascinated and slightly unsettled by how quickly the emotional and moral stakes are being pushed to their limits. As someone who has followed this show with genuine loyalty, I feel compelled to reflect on what is happening now, because it feels like we are witnessing a turning point, not only for the characters, but for the tone of the entire narrative itself. What strikes me most recently is the situation involving Jordan Ashford's recovery and the introduction of a highly skilled plastic surgeon allegedly arranged through Sidwell's influence. On the surface, this appears to be a simple act of intervention, an injured woman being given a chance to restore her appearance after a devastating accident. Yet, as I watch carefully, I cannot ignore the deeper implications being woven into this storyline. The arrival of this surgeon is not just a medical solution, it feels like the opening of a psychological and moral door that may be impossible to close. Jordan, who has always been portrayed as strong, disciplined, and deeply committed to justice, now finds herself in a position where vulnerability has become her greatest weakness. The trauma of her injuries has already shaken her confidence, but what truly concerns me is the emotional shift that follows. I have noticed how the show subtly but persistently moves her from a position of independence toward dependence on Sidwell's resources. This is not accidental storytelling. It feels deliberate, almost calculated, as if the writers are asking us a difficult question. How far would a principled person go to reclaim what they have lost? In my view, the most intriguing and perhaps most troubling aspect of this development is the way Sidwell's influence expands under the guise of generosity. By providing access to a top-tier surgeon, he is not simply helping Jordan recover. He is embedding himself deeper into her life, creating a bond that is difficult to sever. I have seen similar narrative structures before in General Hospital where assistance is never truly free. There is always a hidden cost, a quiet exchange of power that only becomes clear once it is too late to reverse. This reminds me of past situations where characters accepted help from morally questionable figures, only to find themselves entangled in obligations they never intended to assume. The parallel is not exact, but it is strong enough to raise concern. Sidwell's involvement feels like the beginning of a long psychological grip, one that could shift Jordan's entire moral compass. I find myself asking, is she being healed or is she being positioned? What makes this storyline even more compelling is Jordan's potential motivation beyond physical recovery. There is an emerging possibility that she may use Sidwell's resources not only to restore her appearance, but also to uncover the truth behind her accident. This is where the narrative becomes particularly complex. On one hand, it is entirely consistent with Jordan's character to seek justice and answers. On the other hand, the method she may be forced to adopt could place her in direct contradiction with everything she has stood for throughout her career. I cannot help but feel that the writers are intentionally blurring the line between victim and participant. If Jordan chooses to accept Sidwell's help, she may also be stepping into a world where truth and manipulation are inseparable. And if that happens, the question becomes not only who caused her accident, but what she is willing to become in order to uncover it. Another layer that I find particularly interesting is the psychological transformation that may occur if Jordan successfully regains her appearance. One might assume that recovery would bring relief and closure, but in soap opera storytelling, restoration often comes with emotional consequences rather than resolution. I suspect that even if Jordan physically heals, she may not return to her previous state of confidence or clarity. Instead, she may find herself more deeply entangled in Sidwell's influence, questioning whether her choices were truly her own. From my perspective, as a longtime viewer, this is where General Hospital excels at creating moral tension that does not resolve neatly. It forces us to sit with discomfort and uncertainty. I often wonder whether Jordan is being positioned as a future ally to Sidwell, or as someone who will eventually rebel against him in a far more dangerous and personal way than before. Both possibilities feel plausible, and that ambiguity is exactly what keeps me invested. At the same time, I must admit I have some reservations about the direction this storyline is taking. There is a fine line between compelling drama and overwhelming manipulation of character agency. If Jordan becomes too dependent on Sidwell too quickly, there is a risk that her established identity as a strong, justice-driven individual could be diluted. I hope the writers are aware of this balance, because characters like Jordan carry emotional weight that should not be easily reshaped without meaningful consequence. Still, I remain hopeful that there is a broader purpose behind these developments. Perhaps Sidwell's growing influence will eventually expose deeper corruption, or perhaps Jordan's reliance on him will set the stage for a powerful reversal in which she regains control under far more difficult circumstances. The possibility of her using his own system against him is something I find particularly engaging, even if it carries significant risk. As I reflect on everything unfolding, I find myself returning to one central question. Is Jordan being saved, or is she being claimed? The answer is not yet clear, and I suspect it will not be clear for some time, but that uncertainty is precisely what makes this storyline so compelling. It keeps me watching, thinking, and sometimes even worrying about where it might lead. What I do know, after all these years of following General Hospital, is that nothing is ever as simple as it first appears. Every act of kindness carries a shadow, and every recovery comes with a price that may not be immediately visible. And in Jordan's case, I believe we are only beginning to understand what that price might truly be. I have been following General Hospital long enough to recognize when a storyline begins to shift from personal drama into something far more dangerous and morally tangled. And what is unfolding now around Jordan Ashford, Sidwell, and Brooklyn Quartermain is exactly one of those moments that makes me sit a little closer to the screen. At first, I thought Jordan's situation was being framed as a recovery arc. An injured woman trying to regain her life, her appearance, and her sense of control after a devastating accident. Sidwell's sudden generosity in providing access to elite medical care already felt suspicious to me, but I assumed the show might be building toward a familiar pattern: debt, manipulation, and eventual resistance. However, the direction now seems to be pushing far beyond that, into something more unsettling. The idea that Jordan could become a kind of operative or tool for Sidwell is not just dramatic, it fundamentally changes the moral structure of her character. What truly intensifies everything, in my view, is the revelation that Jordan may have discovered Brooklyn Quartermain's involvement in the accident. If this turns out to be true in the way the story is hinting, then we are no longer dealing with a simple accident investigation. We are looking at a deeply personal collision between justice, revenge, and manipulation, all wrapped inside Sidwell's expanding influence. I find myself asking, was Jordan chosen by Sidwell because she was already vulnerable, or because her hidden truth could be weaponized? If Jordan becomes aligned with Sidwell as a result of this discovery, it would not be a straightforward descent into villainy. It would be something far more complicated. From what I have seen over the years, General Hospital rarely transforms a character like Jordan into a pure antagonist. Instead, it tends to place them in morally gray territory, where every decision feels justified from one angle and devastating from another. And this is exactly where I believe the current storyline is heading. The possibility that Brooklyn is connected to the accident introduces an emotional volatility that cannot be ignored. Jordan is not a character who reacts lightly to betrayal or injustice. If she truly believes Brooklyn is responsible, then her alignment with Sidwell begins to make a kind of twisted sense, not because it is right, but because it is emotionally logical. Sidwell offers power, resources, and access to truth, but also control. And in a moment of anger or grief, control can feel like the same thing as justice. But this is where I start to feel uneasy as a longtime viewer. Because once Jordan crosses that line into becoming Sidwell's asset, the consequences are no longer just personal. They ripple outward. She would no longer simply be investigating her own accident. She would be operating inside a system that thrives on secrets, leverage, and coercion. And I cannot help but wonder how much of Jordan's identity would remain intact after such a shift. What makes this even more fascinating is the potential psychological trap being constructed. If Jordan believes she is working with Sidwell in order to uncover the truth about Brooklyn, she may gradually find herself doing things she would have once considered unacceptable. Each step could be rationalized as necessary. Each compromise could be framed as temporary. And that is how characters in this universe often lose their footing, not through one dramatic fall, but through a series of small justifications that accumulate until there is no clear way back. I also find myself thinking about Brooklyn's role in all of this. If she is indeed responsible for the accident, then the story is not simply about guilt or punishment. It becomes about timing and revelation. How long has Jordan been living without knowing the truth? And what happens when that truth is filtered through Sidwell's influence rather than revealed through an honest process? That alone raises the stakes significantly, because information in General Hospital is never neutral. It always comes with intention attached. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that Sidwell is not merely facilitating Jordan's recovery or investigation, but actively shaping the conditions under which she will interpret the truth. If he is aware of Brooklyn's involvement, then Jordan's discovery may not be entirely organic. And if that is the case, then we are looking at a situation where even truth becomes a manipulated resource. I keep returning to one central concern. What happens to Jordan's sense of self if she begins to operate as Sidwell's agent while simultaneously believing she is pursuing justice for herself? That duality could be psychologically explosive. It would place her in a position where every action feels justified in the moment, yet increasingly difficult to reconcile afterward. From my perspective, this is the kind of storytelling that General Hospital does best when handled carefully. Stories where no one is entirely innocent, but no one is entirely lost either. Jordan's potential transformation into Sidwell's ally or operative does not have to mean her downfall. It could also be the beginning of a long and dangerous game of strategy, where she ultimately turns the tables. But that outcome would require patience and careful writing, because otherwise the emotional integrity of her character risks being overshadowed by the mechanics of the plot. So I find myself watching this development with a mixture of concern and fascination. Concern, because Jordan is being pulled into a system that thrives on moral compromise. Fascination, because the Brooklyn revelation adds a deeply personal layer that could justify almost any emotional reaction she has next. And in between those two feelings lies the real question the show is asking us. When justice and manipulation begin to look the same, how does a person decide which path they are truly on? At this point, I do not think we have the full answer, but I suspect that whatever comes next will not only reshape Jordan's story, it may also redefine how we understand the cost of truth in Port Charles.